Welcome to Agrimin's first webinar on transition cows. I'm Annie. I am Agrimin's technical support manager, and I'm going to speak second tonight, talking all about trace elements and how they're important for transition cows. First of all, we're going to have Tim Bebbington from Castle Vets, who's very kindly stepped in. So if you registered for the webinar when advertised, it would have been Lucy Giles, who unfortunately has tested positive for COVID. So Tim has very kindly agreed to step in. And then we've also got PJ McGrath, our Republic of Ireland sales manager. So before I hand over to Tim, if you could put questions in the Q&A box as you go along, we'll be able to see them. And then I'll direct them to the correct speaker at the end of the session during our Q&A. But please don't feel that you have to wait. Just type them in that Q&A box as we're going along. So if we get started, I will hand over to Tim and his presentation on transition cows from a veterinary point of view.
Evening, everybody. It's good to have this opportunity to speak to you about transition cows, which is, as I'm sure you've been told many times before, the most important part of a cow's lactation. In fact, it starts really even before she calves, of course. So the most important part also is nutrition, always with dairy cows. If you feed cows well, then everything else falls into place. So this transition period, it really is a risk period for cows. Cows are certainly on a knife edge. Many things are going on. There's lots of changes. They're entering this period where the fetal growth has been accelerating through the dry period up until calving. There's reduced food intake, there's squashing of the rumen by the growing uterus, and all this leads to negative energy balance for certain at the start of the lactation. It could even happen in the dry period. And when that negative energy balance occurs, then you're going to have problems for the cow. It's going to be immunosuppression, and that is never good news. So this negative energy balance is really the key to the problems that can happen in the early lactation. And this negative energy balance being the major issue when it comes to the health of the cow. And that's because of the immunosuppression which occurs at that point. And how that negative energy balance is influenced particularly by dry matter intake. So you've got to prepare your cow to have the capacity to eat as much as possible after she's calved. The energy density of the diet is going to help as well, but the ration consistency is really, really important because you're feeding a rumen, you're not feeding a cow, and you're feeding the bugs in the rumen, and they take a while to adapt to a diet. So just a reminder, that's your rumen. It's a large part of the cow, and it's where all the action occurs. These are little bugs working away in there, and if they're not there doing their job, then your cow stops functioning. Here they are digesting a piece of grass. So with the uterus shrinking right down after calving, we want it to be in a very small, clean state early in lactation so that she has the opportunity to resume cyclical activity, getting calf again, which obviously is the whole story in milk production. But there are these diseases that occur around about transition. The ketosis, the fatty liver, the displaced abomasum, with its opportunity to move after the calf is emptied out of the uterus and there's now space within the abdomen, which is why that rumen needs to be as large as possible in that late dry period to allow it to quickly push down on the abomasum and stop it moving. And then these issues with milk fever and the metritis due to the uterine involution not going correctly and the immunosuppression due to negative energy balance. So all these things that can go wrong, and hopefully they won't, but there will be a few cows in your herd where it may happen, and obviously you're monitoring these to intervene as soon as possible. So monitoring and prevention is really, really important. You've got the option to take blood samples looking for energy balance. You've got post-calving checks where you can look for the ketone bodies, which will develop in cows that are in negative energy balance and are therefore digesting their own body effectively and leading to ketone production. the trace elements, which Annie will talk about in much more detail. And then you've got other things to look at: access to feed, grouping, how you select for serving. All of these things are telling you something about how your herd is performing. I describe this as beyond brown arming. Brown arming sounds a bit rude, but it's really what some vets just do. They put their arm in, not in calf. But why? That's the question. And there are certain characteristics of the cow which tell you how she's coping. Condition score, obviously that changes gradually, but you've got things which you can look at yourself on the farm, which will be really useful information. So rumen fill is absolutely critical, especially in the dry period. The consistency of dung and how well dung is digested. All of those are things which you can monitor on your farm all the time and will tell you an awful lot about the health of your cows. Your vet can tell you about the tone of the uterus, whether it's involuting, and also whether it's coming on to a good tight tone when she's coming on to heat. And the cyclicity, which is the returning to a normal breeding cycle. All of those are things which come into action better when your cows are well fed and well prepared for the next lactation. So just a quick look at this rumen fill. You can score it, and you can score it from the very, very sick cow that's just not eating at all, which is score 1 at the top there, a hollow cow, gradually going down through different scores where you've got increasingly filling rumen. And really what you're looking for when you're looking at your dry cows is score 4. So you're looking for this really coming straight down off the lumbar processes and then filling out. You can almost imagine you can see the rumen there on that middle photograph. And even score 5 where you've got a very full rumen. And you've got a rumen like that in a cow that's in transition in the late dry period, then what's that telling you? Well, it's telling you that the rumen has got capacity there, and that's what she needs for the next lactation. You can also look at the consistency of dung. And we all know that a very sick cow, scouring is a problem. You can get quite loose cows with spring grass as well. It's really effectively an oversupply of nitrogen, but not a problem with spring grass, but perhaps telling you something that's going wrong if you're on the winter feed, as you will almost certainly be into now. What you're looking for is a thicker dung than that, one which you can push your foot into and you get a little bit of a suck back on it as well. So what you might call a thick pancake. In later lactation in the dry cow, an even firmer dung, but not like a horse. And again, you can score this with thin, watery feces, not a well cow at all, to something which comes at score 3, looks like a thick pudding, sticks together, makes a slight plopping sound. So that's the sort of the dung that you're looking for. But don't just concentrate on the consistency of dung, also look at how it's digested as well. So ideally what happens in the rumen is everything is eaten, everything is digested by those bugs and they're working perfectly, in which case if you were to take the dung in your hand, squeeze it, it would just be a creamy emulsion and you would feel no bits at all. As you get more and more undigested fiber, and sometimes even some of the coarser elements of the diet, like maize grain, etc., if that's passing through undigested, well, obviously that's been wasted, which is a real shame, because you'll have paid good money to make that silage or that other concentrate feed. But it's also telling you you've got an upset rumen. Again, it can be scored this, but what you're looking for is something really smooth and creamy, showing a healthy rumen. So use these things, use the rumen fill, the dung consistency and the dung digestibility to judge how your herd is performing. Because prevention is better than cure, and these signs will be early signs of things not going right. Because this transition is the critical part in the cow's year. Okay, that's me. I'll return to
Thank you very much for that, Tim. If anyone's got any questions for Tim, if they could put them in the Q&A box, then once I've spoken and PJ spoken, we'll go through those questions and I'll direct them to the correct speaker. So I'm going to build a little bit on what Tim has just spoken about and talk about how it relates to trace elements. If one of the panelists can just confirm to me that they can see those slides.
Yeah, all good.
Yeah, okay, cool. So yeah, I'm gonna build on what Tim said. So we've got these transition cows that are on a knife edge. They're undergoing a lot of physiological stress during transition. And when we put an animal under stress, that tends to be when we see them, their trace element imbalances come to light. So although that imbalance might always be there, when we put them under stress, we can see the clinical signs of that imbalance. And we can see that in our productivity data, we can see that in our health data, all that sort of thing. So I'm going to talk about trace elements, how they relate to performance during transition, what sort of trace elements we want to particularly look out for. And then I'm going to show you some productivity data that highlights how important those trace elements are for transition cows. So why are trace elements actually important? Why do we want to talk about trace elements in relation to transition cows? Because they're actually associated with a number of factors that affect the performance of these cows, not only during the dry period, but also at point of calving and going forward into their early lactation, how they perform in terms of fertility, how they perform in terms of reaching peak yield. So we can associate trace elements directly with calving problems. If we don't get trace element balance right during that dry period, then we can see cows suffering with calving problems. So that could be things like retained placentas. It could be things like stillbirths. All these things can have a direct effect. We also need to think about calf health and the effect that maternal transfer of trace elements has. So during the final trimester of pregnancy, that's when fetal growth is about 70% of total growth. So there's a lot of pressure on the cow as her dry matter intake is potentially dropping. As Tim said, we need to look at rumen fill, how much space she's got in the rumen as her calf grows. But we also need to think as that calf grows, its demand for trace elements also grow. So for example, something like iodine, the calf at the end of pregnancy has about 5 times the requirement that it had at the start of pregnancy. So we need to think about supplying the cow with enough trace element so that we're also supplying that growing calf with enough trace element. So we've got to get the trace element circulating in the cow so that she can pass it on to the placenta for that growing calf. If that doesn't happen, then we get calves born with problems. So weak, floppy calves or skeletal issues, all sorts of problems that are caused by a trace element imbalance. We've also got to think about getting trace elements right during that transition period because of that cow's fertility going forward. So although in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about sort of bolusing cows at drying off, we're also thinking about maintaining their trace element status. So I'll say that a lot. We're trying to optimize a cow's trace element status. We're not trying to take their trace element status higher and higher. We just want to put them into the normal range so that trace elements don't limit their productivity or health. So when we administer that bolus at drying off, we're trying to cover the dry period and this stage of early to mid lactation where we're thinking about the fertility of the cow. And if we don't get our trace element balance right, then a trace element imbalance can have a direct effect on that cow's fertility. So I'll show you some data in a few slides time on things like returns to service or detection of estrus, that sort of thing. And then finally, we've got to think about performance in the next lactation. So if we have calving problems, metabolic diseases that sort of Tim touched on, if we don't get appropriate energy utilization of the diet, we haven't got a cow that is going to be able to perform at her maximum in her next lactation. So I'm going to talk about the two trace elements in particular tonight, and that's iodine and selenium. And I'm going to talk about those two because they're the trace elements that we most commonly find in shortfall in transition cows, and the trace elements that are really vital for the health of those cows. So iodine is involved in the development of the thyroid gland. So when a cow ingests iodine, that's passed into her bloodstream, and then it needs to be taken to the thyroid to produce thyroid hormone. It's that thyroid hormone that is actually vital for how that cow performs and her health, because it's going to control her energy metabolism. So if she doesn't have enough thyroid hormone, her metabolic rate's going to drop, and that's going to affect her ability to use the ration that we're putting in front of her. The reason that we're going to talk about iodine specifically for sort of dry cows, transition cows, is because it's absolutely crucial for the developing calf. So as I said, that calf is doing 70% of its growth in this final trimester. It's got a big demand for iodine in that time. And if we don't provide the cow with enough iodine, she can't pass that iodine onto the calf via the placenta, and we end up with a calf that is born that is low in iodine. If that is the case, we get the really common presentation of a weak, floppy calf. So it's born, it doesn't want to get up off the floor, really frustrating at 2 o'clock in the morning because it just won't get up. And some of that could be because the cow didn't have enough iodine in those critical late stages of pregnancy. We can also link iodine with other things going forward. So one of the things it's been linked with is detection of estrus. So actually going out and being able to see whether a cow is cycling or not can be related to their iodine status. The other trace element that I'm going to talk specifically about is selenium. And there's a couple of reasons for that. But firstly, because it does have a direct link with iodine. So the metabolism of iodine is linked to selenium status. So we've got to make sure that we've got both of them in balance to make sure that we've got a cow that is as healthy and productive as possible. But aside from that, selenium has a role in its own right in lots of things. So it's absolutely vital for growth in terms of muscle development. So if we think about that growing calf, we've got to supply enough selenium to the cow for her to pass it on to the calf so that the calf is born with selenium in its system, selenium for its own growth, selenium for its own muscle development. It's also really important in correct liver function, antioxidant function, important for the immune system. So we can kind of link all those things together to say selenium is required to have a healthy animal. So to be able to remove toxins from the body, to be resilient to disease. And that's because of its involvement in different enzymes in the body. But a really important trace element, particularly when we start to put this animal under stress. And going back to what Tim said about these cows being on a knife edge during transition, it is a period where they undergo physiological stress. And we've got to try and do everything we can nutritionally to help them to balance their trace element status, to make sure that they can perform and they're not going to be limited by something as simple as a trace element imbalance. The final thing where selenium is important is it's also important for fertility. So that is fertility in its own right, and that's also fertility caused by things like calving issues. So there's strong links between selenium and incidence of retained placentas, or selenium and incidence of mastitis. And when we start to see these diseases occurring, that can have a knock-on effect on the cow's productivity going forward into the next lactation. So how can a bolus actually help? So what the problem we have during transition is the cow is undergoing dietary change. So we take her from the lactating diet onto her dry cow diet, and whether we have her far off and a close up, we might undergo 2 dietary changes. We then take her into her early lactation diet. So she's got some dietary stress there. We're changing her diet. We've also got a significant physiological stress in terms of what we're asking her to do. We're asking her to immediately stop milking. We're asking her to go through a 8 to 10 week dry period where she's got a calf growing inside her. We're then asking her to calve and go back into that lactating group straight away and start to increase her milk yield. A lot of pressure on her alongside a lot of dietary change. Now, she has a trace element requirement every day throughout that process. So she has a trace element requirement during the dry period. She has a trace element requirement during lactation. But what's going to vary is her diet and also her dry matter intake. So as that calf grows, we may see fluctuations in dry matter intake. As we change the diet, we might add more fiber. We can also see fluctuations. What a bolus does is supplies her with the trace elements that she requires every day, despite whether her diet is changing or whether her dry matter intake is increasing or decreasing. So the bolus that we recommend for transition cows is the ALL-TRACE high iodine bolus. So that's a segmented eroding bolus technology. So it's our newest technology that supplies the cow with the trace elements that it needs every day from the point that you administer it at drying off all the way through for 6 months, taking her into her early lactation with the trace elements that she needs throughout that period. And what I would add to that is what we need to say is not all boluses are equal. So you need to think about what bolus to use, what bolus suits your system best, and always ask for the trial data that shows how that bolus is going to be effective in the system that you're running. So I'll give some examples of some of the data that we've got. So this, I've got 3 studies to go through. They're not too long, and they just give examples of the productivity results that can be achieved if we balance the transition cow's trace element status appropriately. So the first study used 60 dairy farms and basically placed 20 farms into each group, with cows either receiving 2 Agrimin boluses, a mineral powder, or no supplementation. So a fairly simple study, 3 groups, and basically measuring performance and productivity diseases associated around that dry period, around that transition period. And what we found was that the cows administered with boluses had a lower incidence of stillbirths and a lower incidence of mastitis going forward. So balancing their trace elements has given them advantage over those negative controls that didn't get any mineral at all, and has also given them an advantage over this mineral powder where there's potential for fluctuating intake of that powder. And then we see a very similar result in terms of afterbirth problems and returns to service. The bolus is supplying her with trace elements that she requires every day, and therefore we're seeing less afterbirth problems and a lower percentage of returns compared to animals that weren't supplemented, and we're still seeing that result compared to animals that were given mineral powder. So the second experiment was an even simpler design. So this just compared cows administered Agrimin boluses at the start of the dry period versus those that weren't supplemented at all. So we've got no positive control in the study. And what we found was that the study went to record incidence of disease all the way up to 2 months post-calving. So what we found was that the cows that had boluses had a lower percentage of cows with retained placentas and a lower percentage of cows with endometritis. So we're seeing a big advantage of, again, balancing these animals' trace element status, allowing them to be resilient to disease, allowing them to avoid these calving problems that can have a direct effect from trace elements. And then the final study that I'm going to show you is actually a milk quality study, which compared 30 pairs of cows, and again, a really simple design, either administered with boluses or where some of the cows were left unsupplemented. So we're comparing what happens if we give these cows some trace element versus those that don't get any additional trace element in their diet. And what we find is that animals that have been administered with boluses have a lower somatic cell count. And as a result of that lower somatic cell count, the number of animals given antibiotics was reduced. So we're, again, allowing this animal to use its own enzymes, its own system to be resilient and optimize its resilience to disease. So just to conclude my slides, what I would say is trace elements are crucial for all cows, but particularly when cows come under stress, for example, during transition. So that point when that cow is on a knife edge, we're putting under a lot of stress, that's where we can see trace element imbalances really come to the fore. What we would recommend is the ALL-TRACE high iodine bolus as an easy, simple solution that can provide peace of mind. So it is going to, once administered at drying off, supply the cow with the same trace elements every day from point of administration all the way up to 6 months. So even if her diet changes, her dry matter intakes change, the bolus is still releasing those trace elements. So what we're aiming to is to reduce possible calving problems, production diseases, that sort of thing, and prepare the cow for a successful, profitable lactation. And also optimize fertility, so aiding the cow holding at first service. And we've got the data that shows that these boluses are able to optimize her trace element status, and then also the data that shows what effect that can have in terms of productivity. So thank you very much. If you've got any questions, please put them in the chat box. And I will hand over to PJ for him to share his screen and talk to you about his experience on his own farm.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. My name is PJ McGrath. I started Agrimin 3 years ago as the sales manager for the Republic of Ireland. I'm from a family farm where our main enterprise is dairying, but we also operate beef and tillage enterprise on our farm. These sort of work well in conjunction with our dairy enterprise. Both my mother and father work on the family farm alongside two of my brothers. I suppose the dairy industry in Ireland differs hugely from the dairy industry in the UK, as it's mainly a spring calving herd, with probably 94% of the total herd spring calving. I suppose this is to do with the grass growth, as most herds like to align their calving with the grass growth, as it just helps profitability and just helps production in the cow overall. The other small percentage of herds operate a split calving herd with autumn calving and spring calving, as they probably have a liquid contract, which is a sort of a historical thing with no liquid contracts being offered anymore in the Republic of Ireland. So I suppose this is where our herd differs a bit, as we operate a split calving herd on our own farm, with probably 70% of the herd calving in the spring and the other 30% calving in the autumn. Probably the autumn herd calve from January, September to November, and then we get a bit of a break for about 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and then with spring calving from January to April. So on our farm, we milk about 400 cows, mainly Holstein cows, with a bit of cemental crosses in them as well, as we find they sort of go well on our Holstein cows. All cows are bred to dairy siders with AI, as we breed our own replacements, as we operate a closed herd. So the remainder that aren't in calves AI are cleaned up with a beef stock bull, and then these calves are brought to slaughter on our own farm in the beef enterprise. Cows probably yield 7,500 litres at 3.65 protein and 4.2 butter fat. So where the boluses fit into our system on our farm is they play a huge role for us. We've probably been using the Agrimin range of products for over 10 years now. With all our cows receiving, all the dairy cows receiving high iodine bolus drying off. It's since we started using them, they've sort of become a key part of our dry off routine. With the cows are milked in the morning, then they receive a dry cow tube and a sealer in the parlour, with them then moved on to the crush where they get a dose, a bolus, and are clipped before they go to the dry cow house for the transition period. Suppose we just find the bolus reassures us that the cows have their required minerals for probably the most essential period of the cow's time in that year or that lactation, as it's your late stage in calf and you're breeding. So like our farm is very busy, like I suppose most farmers are. So we just find the bolus is another job done or another job ticked off. It's one less thing to worry about, as the cow will have her required minerals for the most essential time of the year. So we just find that it works very well for us. It's just another job done by administering the bolus, and it's just simple when they're in the crush, getting the other things done to them. It's just one more add-on when they're in there. So I suppose our aims for transition period is, the aim is to get the cow to calve as easy as possible, and then help her make the adjustment to milking as easy as possible. I suppose less stress for us and less stress for her. So the calving period in general is a very busy time, very stressful time for both farmers and animals. So we have to try and make this transition over from calving as easy as we can for both man and beast. We find by using the Agrimin bolus during or at drying off to help work through the transition period, that it helps us with easier calvings and generally overall a healthier cow, that we've less problems, health issues like milk fever, LDAs, ketosis. Now obviously we still have our fair share of milk fever issues and ketosis, or I suppose subclinical ketosis. We don't actually get that many LDAs, but we still have them issues. But we do find that with the cow having the right amount of minerals in her system each day or over transition period, that we do have less health issues in general, as she does healthier overall. So I suppose then it leads into her going back and calf a lot easier with less health issues, which is obviously the main goal of the transition period, is just to try and get the cow ready for breeding. So obviously we find what we do in the dry period is sets up the year ahead. So obviously if we look after the cow, she's going to look after us next year, make everything easier done for us. So that's basically what I was here to say. So that's my part over. If you have any questions, feel free to put them up there in the chat.
So I'll start with one that actually is probably going to be for you, Tim. So it's talking about the age of cows, and do certain conditions predominate as the animal gets older and has been through a number of calvings? So I guess they're talking about seeing problems with transition dry cows, and does it get worse as the animal gets older?
Yeah, well, it's certainly true, of course, milk fever incidents will increase with age. I mean, that's the one that we're all aware of. I suppose what happens as cows get older is their livers become less efficient. They develop a certain amount of scar tissue, which affects how well they perform, and that's one of the key things. Then there's also the increasing demands of lactation as they move into a higher production cycle as they get older. So they may be finishing the previous lactation in poorer condition because they've produced so much more milk than they have perhaps as a heifer, as a younger cow. So those things will influence across other diseases as well, through perhaps condition and then immunosuppression. Looking back to things which might be worse in younger animals, then it would be potentially metritis. You've got a heifer that hopefully calves without incidents, but there's more possibility with her being younger and not having calved before that there will be sequels to a difficult calving, which will lead to metritis as well at a higher incidence. So you could expect that as well. So it could go both ways.
Yeah, I mean, from a mineral point of view, we certainly see more issues with sort of milk fever as cows get older and as they go through a number of lactations. That those older cows, your fifth, sixth, going on from that, lactating cows are more prone to things like milk fever, not able to cycle calcium out of their bone, as well as the younger cows, heifers, that sort of thing. Do you find that on your farm, PJ, as they go through lactations? Do you see more problems?
Yeah, definitely. Like, say we'd be administering probably a calcium bolus starting over a third hour, just under precaution of milk fever occurring. So we just find it easier to try get there and prevent it rather than try cure it. Just when the cow goes down, it's just a nightmare. So we just feel more confident if we put in a bolus starting over a third calver.
Yeah. Right. So the next question is it possible to over mineral when bolusing and feeding cake? So I'll start that one, and if anyone wants to jump in, feel free. The answer is yes, it is possible to give a cow too much mineral. It depends on which mineral we're talking about. So the one to really bear in mind and make sure that it isn't in oversupply at any point would be copper. So it is different to things like iodine that I've spoken about tonight. Copper is stored in the body. So that means that a cow can build up her stores of copper. And if we're not careful, she can reach a level which is too high. And that can then start to have a negative impact on her productivity and her health. The next most common one in terms of oversupply, as well as the most common in terms of undersupply, is actually selenium. So there was an article in Farmers Weekly recently that showed from some research at Harper Adams University that 86% of dry cows are underfed selenium, but it is a trace element that we also need to watch out for in terms of oversupply and the problems that can cause. So if that's a concern, what I would recommend is that you look at all the places that mineral is coming into that diet and compare that with the animal's requirement and see whether you're meeting it, whether you're oversupplying, whether you're undersupplying, and then review what can be done about that. But they would be the two that we would be concerned if they reach too higher oversupply. Add anything to that, Tim?
Well, I'll just echo what you said about copper. I mean, I do a lot of work with sheep, and copper poisoning is much more common than copper deficiency. People often kill sheep with kindness. But when it comes to cattle, I've certainly seen copper poisoning in cattle, and we were doing a trial work several years ago where we were trying to determine the potential growth of a bunch of cattle by feeding them intensively to see what they could achieve, so we could then break them down into groups for a third trial, and that over supply of concentrate led to copper poisoning in those animals, and we had to quickly rein right back. In fact, it stopped the trial in its tracks because we ran into problems almost straight away when we fed these young cattle a lot of concentrate, which also included copper. And I think we were dealing with stock that had come from dairy farms where I suspect they had been over supplemented prior to their birth. So they were born in a state where they had copper loading in their liver. It didn't take a lot to push them over the edge.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I think a lot of the time that the times that we see copper poisoning out on farm is where copper is coming in from multiple sources. So people are, like you say, killing them with kindness because they think they need that, they need that, they need that, but they need to review what the overall concentration is of that copper going into the diet. So what's the next? Is it 1 or 2 boluses? If 2, do you have to administer in 2 applications? So the bolus that I've talked about tonight is the ALL-TRACE high iodine, and you need to administer 2 boluses, but they fit in the applicator together. So it's 2 boluses because they're eroding boluses. They will not work if you just administer 1. They need to have 2 in the rumen to knock against each other, but they fit in the applicator together. So although it's 2 boluses, it's only 1 application. Another question, probably also directed at you, Tim. What's the most common issue seen on farm through the transition period? For example, is it LDA or ptosis or something else?
Well, that depends on your farm, doesn't it, really? So I can't really give a general answer for that. I hope it wouldn't be LDA because that would be pretty disastrous. Ketosis has been subclinical or not glaringly obvious, probably is pretty common, and individual milk constituent information often will highlight that. So people who milk record and have that kind of data will find, if they plot the graphs, which can be done through the various software systems, that yes, there may well be quite a lot of ketosis in your herd at certain times of the year, to do with probably quality of the feed that you're presenting. And you may already know that you're entering such a risk period because you're making financial decisions based on milk price and where you are with your silage supplies, etc. So I appreciate it's difficult to avoid these issues entirely, but from farm to farm and from time to time, certain things will raise their heads, and all of them, when they become obvious for you to see clinically, then that tells you there's quite a lot going on subclinically as well.
All right, thanks, Tim. Another question, which I'm going to send to you, I think, PJ. What would farmers consider to be a standard regime in the transition period? I ask because in my experience, some farmers seem to think of the transition period as a time to leave the animals alone.
Well, I suppose from that farmer's point of view, it's probably after a lot of work going on the previous few months when they get the back and calf, and he's probably looking for maybe a bit of rest himself as well as the cow. But I suppose for us, our stand would be cows are dried off, then they depend on condition. Some cows are dried off in 90 days before calving, or maybe down to 60 days, just depending on the cow's overall body condition. Obviously, the thinner ones just need a little bit longer to recover before calving. But most are on a mainly silage diet with, I suppose, a high inclusion of straw, just to try to increase their stomach capacity, and just, to carry them over. It's a bit cheaper than silage. And then to be moved on calving, then I suppose to be swapped over to a higher plane of nutrition to get them increase their milk yield. That sort of covered the question. Or
Okay. Anything to add to that, Tim? Anything you see your farmers doing in sort of your part of the world?
No, I think that's a pretty fair summary, and I think how people can achieve that depends on their feeding systems, the number of transition cows they've got as well, because sometimes it can be achieved, the incorporation of straw into a TMR quite easily if you've got a large enough group. But there'll be other times when the group is small and it's difficult to achieve that, and you might be driven towards other solutions, maybe a silage solution, which, as PJ said, could be expensive but might be your only option because you just can't get the incorporation of the straw and the prevention of sorting. Which the key thing, I think, is to look at rumen fill in those transition cows. Are they eating enough? And if they're not eating enough, then the next thing that will follow will be the ketosis in early lactation and the LDAs as well. And as vets, unfortunately, we've occasionally seen that where the wheels have come off, and it's typically they're not eating, and that's a real issue in that transition period.
The other issue, I suppose, is just trying to swapping them over to the milking cow diet is probably a big issue as well. Going from such a coarse plain feed to a rich feed, I suppose, is another. It's very hard to manage or hard to do it right.
Yeah, because you're trying to get bugs there adjusted to a completely different diet, and you're quite right, PJ. That's really difficult, and that's why it is this knife edge.
Yeah, okay. The next question is, looking at using the dry cow bolus because of an identified low manganese, but also high liver copper levels. So this product offers the safest balance. Would you recommend application at dry off or 3 weeks pre-calving to maximize cover in the post-calving service period? So it's interesting. We never used to talk about manganese, and it's definitely coming up as a problem more and more. I think people having problems with calves at point of calving, and then it being identified as a manganese problem probably earlier in pregnancy. So what I would recommend is that it is at drying off, because what we need to do is make sure that we're supplying, if we've identified that cow has a manganese issue, that we are going to supply her with enough manganese in late pregnancy to try and avoid any problems that may come at calving. And that will also take her into her next lactation, hopefully, to help her in terms of that post-calving service, fertility issues that may come. So my answer on that one would be at drying off. Does anyone want to add anything to that?
I suppose the experience we've had with manganese issues would even point you to going further back again.
Yeah, I was just
into late lactation. I think it seems to be an issue of the deformity in the calf rather than anything which is happening post calving. So with that 120-day efficacy, I think I'd want all of that almost within the pregnancy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier. What we really want to do is to avoid fluctuations in that cow's trace element status. So if we can keep her manganese in the normal range, then we rule out that causing her a problem in terms of that, like you say, Tim, that calf's skeletal development. But yes, I understand what you're saying in terms of you've also got high liver copper levels. So how do you manage that in the boluses? What I would say is try and minimize any other copper going into that animal's diet. The copper in the boluses is copper oxide, so it is the safest form of copper available on the market. So if we can supply that bolus, which is giving the animal the manganese it needs, and look at the rest of the diet in terms of making sure that we're not adding additional copper in any other way, the ideal would be to boost their sort of manganese status and then maintain it to take away any risk of those skeletal deformities in the calves. Next question is, would bolusing help with lameness? Does anyone want to take that one? Everyone's favourite question.
Well, I suppose the only evidence I know of which would indicate a trace element importance in lameness would be zinc. I'm not going to talk about the zinc content of your boluses because I don't know exactly what it is. I could speculate, but I expect that's your area, Annie.
Yeah. So what I would say is it depends, but it would be rare that it would be zinc causing the problem. We do a biotin bolus, but again, yes, there is some evidence linking lameness with biotin, but normally these issues with lameness are multifactorial. It will not be just a nutritional issue that's causing that lameness. There will be other factors that are involved. So it could be entry, exit to parlors, where the cows are walking, how tight they're turning, Are we seeing some sort of bacterial infection that's causing lameness? I would investigate all those things and not just kind of assume that there is a nutritional problem going on. Perhaps if we've ruled everything else out, we might look at using zinc and biotin, but they wouldn't be my first go-to.
I completely agree with that. I'm glad you said it. The only thing I think where I've seen issues with horn quality has been in rapidly growing pigs. And they are growing so fast that they may struggle with zinc or biotin supply and have poor quality of hooves and therefore lead to lameness. But I think that's, as you say, with in nearly all cases, you look at the environment when you're talking about lameness rather than necessarily a trace element.
Yeah, I would agree. So the next one, don't most high yielding cows go into ketosis after milk? So they've been away from feeding for a while being milked, and we're talking about on herds yielding about 12,000 litres plus. Thoughts on that, Tim?
Well, it's very difficult to have a cow produce 12,000 litres. And if you want to have that kind of a life, then talking about a knife edge, you might be talking about a scalpel edge. So it's a very narrow comfort zone that you'll be in, and you'll spend your life on your toes all the time, which if you want to be farming in that way, then of course you can. And you'll need to be feeding your cows very effectively, offering them excellent quality forage all the time in the best possible way, maybe putting out many times a day to achieve those types of yields. And we have clients who are up at that level, and their quality of their forage particularly, and the way that they conserve it, present it to their herds, and the way that they feed their cows is top notch, or they won't achieve that. I'm sure, as the correspondent says, that there will be quite a lot of ketosis in those herds at a subclinical level, hopefully not a clinical level, and they are on a knife edge, and you've got to be very aware of anything that's going to upset a cow's ability to eat, whether it be social pressures or whatever. Anything like that, anything which interrupts it, will cause cows to fall off that knife edge and cause problems. So it's true that they are on the verge of clinical ketosis, with subclinical ketosis being underdiagnosed in those herds all the time, I'm sure. Very difficult not to be.
Yeah. How do your boluses work compared to other boluses on the market? So there are different ways that boluses can work, but essentially what they need to achieve is a sustained and controlled release. So we need to be able to administer that bolus and then it control the release of the trace elements that are within it for whatever the designated time period is for that bolus. So the way that Agrimin boluses work is using eroding technology. So once they're administered, they sit in the reticulum of the cow. Their density keeps them there. So if you pick up a bolus, it'll feel fairly heavy. They sit in the bottom of that reticulum and they erode against each other over time. So that means that we can control their release rate by looking at the erosion rate of the bolus. And how we do that is using different lab methods, but also using fistulated cows out in New Zealand. So cows that have a space in the room and you can put your arm in, put a bolus in, and we can look at how those boluses are eroding in those cows. And we can control that bolus erosion rate. That controls how those boluses erode. The advantage that has over things like leaching boluses, which you'll commonly see in the market, or dissolving boluses that you'll see in the market, is that we get an immediate release of trace elements as soon as the bolus is administered. So we could say that trace elements are supplied to the animal from day one all the way through to the end of the bolus life. We don't have to wait in terms of there's no delay in how that bolus works. Whereas other boluses as soon as they're administered, they may not work straight away. The other advantage of an eroding bolus is that there's no residue at the end of the bolus life, so that there's nothing left. There's nothing for that cow to regurgitate. There's nothing for the cow to excrete. Everything is gone. So I hope that answers that question. We are at 8 o'clock, so we're just over time. So I'm going to wrap it up there. If you have asked a question that has not been answered, I apologise. Please send it over to us. Give us a call, send us an email, and we'll be able to answer your questions. So thank you to PJ and Tim for joining us tonight, and thank you for everyone that's attended.